One of the ideas that's fascinated me the most is the idea of rejected media. It's why I have a whole playlist on this channel, a whole series, where I take a look at ideas that were scrapped, projects that were canceled, or maybe things that started to get their feet off the ground and then something came barreling in and knocked it right back on its butt. Zack Snyder's Snyderverse, or the DCEU, is one of those things that has a lot of scrapped ideas. That said, there have been a few projects recently that have come to surface about DC and surrounding the characters, including the canceled, or should I say completely rejected and reworked, Wonder Woman 1854. Now, this was originally a movie that was being worked on by Zack Snyder, but there are a lot of reasons that it did not materialize and ended up becoming something different, along with a lot of misinformation around the movie that I think people don't actually know isn't true. So before we hop further into it, if you do enjoy today's video, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. We appreciate you very much on this channel here. We also do have new resin products up on our store, cosmobunny.shop. Link will be in the description, and I will talk a little bit more about that at the very end of the video. And a small question of the day from me: would you ever like to see any of the ideas of the Snyderverse or the old DCEU restored in any way? Animated, live action, whatever. I hope it doesn't become a war, but it's something I'm interested in because I'm so fascinated by the ideas of media that never went on to be made. Something interesting is that while this is making the news rounds in the last couple weeks, Zack Snyder actually shared this image again all the way back in January 5th of 2021 on Twitter, saying Wonder Woman 1854. This amazing image shot by Steven Berkman of an Elseworld, war-weary Diana who had chased Ares across the battlefields of the world and had yet to meet Steve, who would help her restore her faith in mankind and love itself. And I thought this was very interesting because even though this came up all the way back in 2021, it's not something a lot of people were talking about at the time. It got 48,000 likes on Twitter, and I do believe it made a little bit of a news cycle, but it was very surprising to me to see this coming up again now, and I was wondering what changed. I mean, there has been a clamor for some of these ideas being restored. People want to see them back in live action or animated versions or whatever. But I was kind of thinking, why did this come back up? Was it just a slow news day? Well, it turns out that Zack Snyder was actually interviewed by Empire Magazine and went on to talk a lot about the scrapped idea that was going to be this Wonder Woman film. People are very much misunderstanding what this film would have been, because this film, 1854, you have to understand, would have taken place, I would say, about almost 70 years before the actual movie that we got of the original Wonder Woman film. So that means that instead of World War I, this would have taken place in the Crimean War, and it would have actually led to meeting Steve Trevor. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Steve Trevor is obviously not in his 60s or 70s when we see him in the World War I conflict in the original Wonder Woman movie. And that's where a lot of the misinformation is coming from, because a lot of people are thinking that this was a prequel, that this was a movie that was going to come out after the original Wonder Woman movie, but be about a conflict beforehand. That's not actually the case. When this was being planned, this was going to be the movie that we would have gotten instead of the original Wonder Woman movie. Because I've seen a lot of people say, well, this would have been much better than Wonder Woman 1984, and while I agree, because Wonder Woman 1984, in my opinion, was a huge letdown, this was actually not going to be the proposed sequel or prequel or anything to Wonder Woman 1. This was going to take place instead of Wonder Woman 1. Zack Snyder actually cleared up a lot of that in this interview, and I thought it was very interesting because he actually said that my idea for it would be that she would travel around the world looking for Ares, and she would go to every place where there was conflict. On those battlefields, she found these lovers, warriors, and they would age out because she is immortal, he elaborated. They would be her lover for 10 years, or they might die in battle, and it was probably sad for a lot of the guys because they would see her starting to be nice to the next young soldier and be like, oh, I'm being replaced. But all the guys that she had with her were those loyal warriors she found on the battlefields all over the world. Now, something interesting about this I do want to mention is two things. First off, there are some cool ideas to this movie The idea of seeing Wonder Woman in the Crimean War, seeing her in all these different conflicts, being disillusioned with mankind, which is something that was mentioned before and also alluded to in the tweet that he had posted in 2021, saying that meeting Steve would help her restore her faith in mankind and love itself. But I do want to say that there are two things that are a bit good and bad about this. First off, we already established that this movie would eventually become the Wonder Woman movie, the first one that we know from the early DCEU. Now, that movie was actually basically written almost entirely by Alan Heinberg. He's actually the man behind that movie, and he was brought in by Zack Snyder to write an official and proper script, and there is a lot of misinformation around Zack Snyder with this that I did actually want to clarify. Because there's a lot of people who worship the ground Zack Snyder walks on, he can do no wrong. I would argue there's equally as many people who just hate the guy, very blatantly. Anything he touches is this disgusting piece of garbage and they're angry at anyone who likes it. I don't really consider myself in either camp. I really enjoyed the early DCEU. I do think it had a lot more direction than later films, even though it wasn't always comic accurate. I liked the way that they were taking it. I also am hoping new DC movies are good going forward. Turf war aside, I do think it's worth noting though that Alan Heinberg doesn't often get the credit that he deserves as the writer of Wonder Woman. He's actually somebody who really loved the character, and he fell in love with the character of Diana when actually reading his first ever comic book, which was issue 212 of Wonder Woman. Now, this was actually archived from Tulsa World, and I will include the link to this along with all the other links in the description down below. But there are some very interesting quotes here about how the original Wonder Woman was made instead of 1854. Now, Alan Heinberg actually in 1994, 20 years after buying his first Wonder Woman issue, made his first play produced off-Broadway called The Amazon's Voice, about a man asked to reconceive the Wonder Woman character for a modern audience. And I thought this was interesting as well. Heinberg was chosen in 2006 to write the 5-issue arc Who is Wonder Woman when the storyline was relaunched, when the comic book was actually relaunched, and when the CW looked for a writer for a new TV series about Wonder Woman in 2012, they hired Heinberg to write a pilot for a show called Amazon, which was not picked up. He said, "At that moment I was devastated, but it turned out to be a good thing because a lot of the ideas ended up on screen in the movie." He said, "I related to the idea of heroes always striving to make the world better, saying that it's her driving ambition to make the world a better place, her duty to keep mankind from war, and she brings this passion and innocence to it that is so great. She leaves home and sees the evil that lurks in man, but she believes in altruism, and that allows her to prove herself to be a hero again and again. She believes in love, and she comes to realize her ultimate purpose is to love and not to fight." Now, the reason that I think Heinberg is so important is because a lot of people attribute Wonder Woman to Patty Jenkins. Now, Patty Jenkins did direct the Wonder Woman movie and did have a hand in it, but she was much more involved in the storytelling and script process of Wonder Woman 1984. I will let that speak for itself. I'm not trying to say that Patty is not somebody who can make a story, but I personally think that 1984 was a massive step down from the work that Alan Heinberg did on the original Wonder Woman. It's also worth mentioning, though, that he did work with a team of other writers as well. There were other people working with him, and I did want to point out as well that Jeff Johns actually introduced Heinberg to Zack Snyder, and then it kind of was one of those things where it just started happening. Heinberg said, "I never anticipated him going for that, because the film became more about the Steve Trevor Diana romance, an idea that is often absent in this kind of movie." And he went on to talk about it and say, "So when Zack asked me to create the movie with him and make it more of a romantic movie than an action movie, no one was more surprised than I was." And the reason that I want to talk about this a little bit is because I think a lot of people look at Zack Snyder and they look at his work and they think that all he cares about is action, especially with some of the recent comments as well, some of which I actually disagree with, where he talked about how he thinks comic book fans are brainwashed into believing certain ideas about their characters and that there's no way to leave those ideas. I do understand what he's saying, but I also don't really agree with some of those concepts. That said, it is worth noting he's the one who wanted Alan Heinberg to come in and write the original Wonder Woman movie we got instead of 1854, as he was working on other films. And of course, as well, we do also have the fact that even though he posted this image, and even though he did talk about wanting Wonder Woman to meet these lovers on the battlefield, he ultimately went with the idea that the storyline about just Steve Trevor and Wonder Woman as more of a solid singular romance was more impactful. And that's something I think is really good, because he went on to talk about it and say that it was never an actual screenplay, but we talked about it so much that it kind of had its own life. And he did say as well that we talked about if Steve Trevor would have been there in Crimea, but instead they went that other direction. Something I think about this that's interesting is that while there are many different types of love, and it is okay to go through potential loves or loves and then end up finding one later, I do think that for an on-screen story with characters, it doesn't add quite as much depth or as much impact to losing Steve Trevor if you see her go through all of these romances beforehand. Now, that doesn't mean that she can't have romances. It's just one of those things that I think, for me personally, when you're looking at the Wonder Woman story, the original 1854 look did look a lot more like this badass warrior, even more so than we got in Wonder Woman 1. But I also think that it ran the risk of losing a lot of heart of what the love story eventually became. It lost a lot of the heart of the Wonder Woman that had faith in mankind. Even in the image, she's holding the heads of multiple soldiers. Now, I understand that in war there's going to be violence, and I know that Zack Snyder movie fans really like violence in the movies. They really like these more war-torn, serious storylines. As somebody who actually loves the BVS Ultimate Cut, I get it, but I do think that Wonder Woman was one of those movies that had a lot of heart and soul, and I worry that tampering heavily with what we got would have kind of led away from that. I think that Zack Snyder bringing in someone like Heinberg, who had been so in love with this character for decades, to write the movie that we got, ultimately was a much better look at the Wonder Woman character. That said, I also do understand the mindset that this is a very badass looking Diana. Now, something odd to me about this whole thing that has never been addressed that I would be interested in hearing in the comments down below if you have an opinion on, is the idea of Elseworlds. Elseworlds are obviously a multiverse concept, the idea of not being the main timeline. When Zack first talked about Wonder Woman 1854 in his tweet, he called it an Elseworld war-weary Diana, but when he went on to talk to Empire, and every time this has come up in any way since, it's been alluded to that this was just the Diana that we know. I'm not really sure if the reason he said Elseworld was because it was like, in another reality I would have made this movie instead, or why, but I'd be interested to hear if you have an opinion on that down below. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on the movie that we got. Also, if you want to tell me your thoughts on Wonder Woman 1984, a lot of dates here, you can let me know those. I was pretty disappointed by it compared to her characterizations in BVS and also in, of course, the first Wonder Woman film, but let me know what you think down there. And as always, we had the question of the day. We do have a Fortnite creator code if you want to help support this channel, which is DJAY123. That helps us a lot, and that code can also be used on our store, cosmobunny.shop, where we sell resin pieces. We also do sell handmade jewelry, which is wonderful, from my wife. Something I did want to mention with these resin pieces is they are comic book and manga pages that have been preserved in resin. They are from comic books that actually were damaged, that are unable to be sold by local stores. A lot of them were on their way to landfills, and what we did instead was we took them, we turned them into something transformative, we recycled them, we recycled all the paper we didn't use. We even send this out in recycled packing materials from stuff that we've gotten as well. So we do hope that you'll check that out as well. All these things help support our channel in a very unsteady YouTube landscape, and we appreciate you so much. Have a fantastic day, and as always, everyone, stay shui.